You hear a lot of people complaining these days about how everyone's so woke now, you can't make fun of anything anymore. But let's take the horrific violence inflicted on Palestinians by the Israeli military, for example. Something I think a lot of people would struggle to find the comedy in. But let's give it a try. I say Israeli military, but they actually call themselves the Israeli Defense Force, which I think is a pretty funny name. Defense Force. It sounds like an 80s toy range. Defense Force. Defending force with even more force. Then there's misleading headlines. The systematic prioritizing of the Palestinian rocket attacks over the always deadly Israeli bombing campaigns. Here are just some from the BBC over the last few days. The barrage of Palestinian militant rockets. And Israeli airstrikes grows. Israel, Gaza. Rockets hit Israel. After militants killed. Rockets target Tel Aviv. After Gaza tower destroyed. Palestinian militants in Gaza have fired dozens of rockets at Israel. After its airstrikes have killed top commanders and felled another power. Middle Eastern Eye even resorted to making this handy guide on misleading and problematic language being used by most media outlets, taking a red pen to this New York Times article. But you've got to see it from the editor's point of view, right? It's really important to state that the Israeli Defense Force are only bombing civilians because Hamas launched rockets, okay? We've got to make that clear. Yeah, but why did Hamas launch rockets? Oh well, you don't want to go into too much detail, come on. We'll be here all day. I mean, what are we supposed to make of Hamas's motives from this? Something like members of Hamas sitting around a fire toasting marshmallows? Oh, it's just another peaceful night here in the Middle East. Maybe we should fire some rockets at Israel. What do you say, guys? Just a few, just dip our toe, stir up the pot a little, see what response we get. You never know, maybe the Israelis will surrender. So, a month ago, a report came out by the organisation Human Rights Watch, claiming that the Israeli state is committing crimes of apartheid and persecution against the Palestinian people. Now that sounds like quite a damning indictment to me. If I was a member of the Israeli government, or the Israeli public, I would be deeply concerned by this. But the Israeli Foreign Ministry's response was that the report was preposterous and false. Now, if the British government were accused of such crimes and just flat out rejected them in this way, I would be a little bit worried. I would think, maybe you should look into this. Yeah, maybe it could cause some problems down the line, like maybe in a month's time even. The Foreign Ministry went on to accuse the HRW of having a long-standing anti-Israeli agenda. Why would an organisation have a long-standing agenda against the Israeli state? Now, just a few weeks before, the International Criminal Court said it was going to investigate possible war crimes committed by the Israeli state against the Palestinians. To this, the Israeli government said it would not be cooperating, with the Prime Minister's office saying Israel absolutely rejects the claim that it has carried out war crimes. Well, you know what they say, if you've got nothing to hide. Even Britain and the US hold the official position that Israel's current occupation of Palestinian land is illegal, as does the UN. And both Britain and the US officially condemn the Israeli government's future plans of further annexation.
I don't call it annexation, I call it applying sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. You cannot annex something that belongs to you. When you annex something, you do it from a foreign territory. So I don't know from whom we are annexing it.
You say you reject the word annexation because you cannot annex what is yours. Do you believe in international law, Ambassador?
Absolutely. And I explained to my colleagues in the Security Council about our rights to the land. So it's
greatest of respect, Ambassador, this notion that the land, the occupied West Bank is yours, is not in any accordance with international law as defined by independent jurists right across the world, and you know it.
I beg to differ with you.
This was the former Israeli ambassador to the UN on HARDtalk in July 2020, when with huge support from the Trump administration, Netanyahu's government was threatening to annex even more Palestinian land.
In the immediate past, we have 3 different Israeli former prime ministers who are saying this is entirely wrong. At least 2 of them, to my knowledge, because they've done it to me personally, use the word apartheid about what Israel would be if it proceeded with this annexation. Tzipi Livni, who I'm sure you know well, and we've interviewed on HARDtalk many times, recently said annexation, her word, would fundamentally jeopardize the nature of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. Do none of these people and their words give you pause for thought?
Absolutely not.
The Israeli government eventually backed down from this due to enormous international pressure. But this further annexation is the direction of travel that Netanyahu and co. wish to take. After all, the Palestinian state is not recognized by Israel. So from an Israeli perspective, nothing they're doing is illegal. Because as the ambassador said, they're not annexing it from anywhere or from anyone. It's like that zoned land in SimCity. It's a place, but there's nothing in that place. For Palestinians living in Israel, and in particular Palestinians living in the zoned SimCity squares around Israel, Palestinians don't have any human rights. Because you are given or denied human rights by the state. But in Palestine's case, there is no state. There is only the occupying Israeli force. So when Palestinians are protesting against the Israeli state, they are protesting for their human rights. And this is just the status quo in Israel. This is just day in, day out.
6.4 million exiled Palestinians barred by Israel from returning to their homelands since 1948. Israel controls the land, air, and sea. Today, Israeli authorities maintain a single regime of control over the borders, airspace, population registry, and economic activity of the territories of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israel controls all Palestinian airspace and telecommunications. 90% of historic Palestine under exclusive Israeli control. Israel controls all Palestinian natural resources, segregated road system. All the yellows are accessible only to Israelis. Then you have roadblocks, trenches to prevent access to main roads and travel between Palestinian enclaves. And you have Israeli-only bridges and tunnels connecting Israeli settlements east of the separation wall. Ramallah has a West Bank mountain aquifer, apparently, where Israel takes 80% of the water from the mountain aquifer each year and appropriates the water resources. There's a controlled supply where Israeli authorities enforce annual quotas on the amount of water available to Palestinians. There's an obstruction of development. No new Palestinian wells approved by Israeli authorities in the most productive Western aquifer since 1967.
It only becomes news when Palestinians, through desperation, become violent. Now, under these conditions, it's never a surprise when violence breaks out. However, the latest escalation was caused by an intensification of the persecution of Palestinians living in and around Israel, on top of the usual persecution, the day-to-day persecution administered by the Israeli state.
For no logical reason, the Israeli police are moving in and in a very blunt way controlling, as they say, the crowd, a crowd which doesn't, as far as we've seen, need any control. These are families, lots of young people as well, young boys here too, who are at the end of their Ramadan fast are gathering here. We've seen over the course of the evening, water cannon filled with a rancid skunk, as it's known, is sprayed at people, sprayed a little bit earlier on at young boys who were gathered up at the wall here.
The skunk water, as it's known, is a putrid yeast concoction that is often blasted at Palestinian civilians and is reported to cause nausea, vomiting, and leave a smell that can last months. But the most incendiary move by the Israeli authorities in recent weeks was to send militarized police into one of the most important mosques in the world. The raid resulted in 300 Palestinians being injured and a small number of them critically. Why did police enter the mosque? To ask such a question simply shows one's naivety to the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli police. A better question would be, why shouldn't Israeli police go into any mosque they like? The Prime Minister of Israel relies heavily on the support of far-right nationalists and the Israeli settler movement, whose aim is to continually expand the territory of Israel and wipe Palestine from the map. And so it is through violence and fear that Netanyahu has maintained power, and so it is only through further violence and fear that he will continue to. And so it was for all of these reasons that Hamas once again decided to fire rockets at Israel, which, by the way, injured no one. And yet, the Israeli Defense Forces' response was an airstrike that killed 20 people, including children. Since then, both sides have increased their attacks, but Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world, and Hamas is like a dad's army rocket division. Of the thousands of rockets that are sent towards Israel, few make it through the Israelis' high-tech defense, and death is incredibly rare on the Israeli side. But it's very hard to get actual figures on how many people are being killed on either side, because such information always reflects badly on the Israeli narrative of self-defense. What you often see reported is the total death toll, and it's only by reading very closely that you find out that nearly all of those are on the Palestinian side. Take this classic example from NBC, which was the first thing that came up when I googled how many Israelis have been killed. Over 70 killed as Israel-Palestinians exchange worst violence in years. And then when you go down to the first paragraph, in the worst flare-up of violence in 7 years, Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes and Palestinian militants fired hundreds of missiles so far this week, killing more than 70 people. So you have Palestinian militants fired hundreds of missiles written second, and then you have a comma, and then you have killing more than 70 people. You would be forgiven for thinking that the Palestinians had killed the 70 people, or at the very least the Palestinians had killed the majority of 70 people. Now, if you go actually into the article all the way down to this paragraph here, at least 65 people, including 16 children, were killed in the Israeli bombardment. So nearly all of the deaths were on the Palestinian side. As it stands, the Israelis have killed over 200 Palestinians in the last week or so, while Hamas have killed 10 people in Israel. The deaths on both sides is so often of innocent victims, but the Palestinians, who are fighting for their human rights, for their very existence, have no other way of fighting but through rioting, throwing stones, or in the case of Hamas, firing rockets. The occupation of Palestinian land and the subjugation of its people is therefore incredibly dangerous for everyone involved, including Israelis. But the Israeli government has no intention of finding a peaceful solution, and in fact in the last few weeks has successfully escalated the violence. Many progressive Jews with the means have left Israel for a peaceful, safer life in Europe and the US. They don't want to live in a society where right-wing vigilante groups can roam the streets with impunity, where their children are indoctrinated into hatred of the other, and where violence and war on their own streets is an inevitable consequence of their own government's action. But none of this is ever discussed in the tightly controlled reporting by most major media organisations, including, of course, the BBC. This was BBC News on May 15th.
There was an assumption among some in Israel that the conflict was more or less over and simply had to be managed. Now, the tension here and the events of the last week or so have shown that that is not the case.
By conflict here, he means those occasions when Palestinians decide to actually fight back. And by managed, he means the ongoing annexation and apartheid. Why won't Palestinians just simmer down and accept their slow annihilation?
With militants continuing to be targeted, images released by Israel's military show an operation that's not letting up. Officials say dealing a strong blow to deter Hamas will take more time. And Hamas isn't stopping its fire either. Its rockets, as always, are indiscriminate.
From this reporting, you'd be forgiven for thinking Israelis are being really responsible by just hitting military targets, while Hamas don't care. But the supposedly targeted bombings of the Israeli military hit an extraordinary number of Palestinian homes and kill an extraordinary number of civilians. While all indiscriminate means here is that Hamas rockets are pieces of crap that rarely hit anything.
The violence between Israel and Palestinians has escalated rapidly.
This is Ros Atkins, BBC News' answer to Zoomer's predilection for online news content.
Clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Hamas is launching rocket attacks on Israel. Israel's carrying out airstrikes in Gaza. And the funerals have begun, with deaths on both sides.
I think Atkins needs more memes if he really wants to cut through. Not that I'm in any position to talk, really. But if I were to give him some advice, I would say this would be a good one. Or this one. If I say it's both sides, then no one can accuse me of bias. I think Atkins could also do with his own chat. And maybe film the whole thing while playing Happy Wheels.
Political purposes for both.
So why is the UK media so reluctant to call out Israel? Well, sadly, even though it wouldn't go against the UK government's own foreign policy, it would go against the UK government's foreign policy rhetoric, which is to never condemn Israeli policy of apartheid and persecution, then to condemn Hamas rocket attacks, and then, only then, to condemn Israeli airstrikes. Israel is a key ally of the UK, just as the US is, and just like the US, it makes little difference who is in power or what they're doing. The UK will support its position and refrain from criticism even if the UK officially acknowledges what Israel is doing is illegal. A term that you will hear bandied about a lot about the situation in the Middle East is that it's complicated. But what is complicated about Israel is not what it's doing to Palestine. but its relationship with both the US and the UK's governments, intelligence services, arms manufacturers, and trade agreements. You'll notice similar rhetoric when it comes to any ally of the UK and the US. US politics is itself complicated for the UK to deal with. Saudi Arabia, that's a complicated situation. Russia, on the other hand, isn't complicated at all. Russia's just bad. Iran is just bad. China, it's just bad. Cuba, it's just bad. Venezuela, it's just bad. In 1984, an active MP of British Parliament was arrested by British police for protesting against South African apartheid. You might have heard of him, he's called Jeremy Corbyn. We often look back at photos like this and wonder how the government could take this position, how so much of the public were indifferent or confused by the situation. But there is hope. Over 100,000 people marched in solidarity with the Palestinian people on the 15th of May in central London.
In the midst of this crisis, I say this, there is a point of hope. The whole world is seeing in real time what is actually happening. Our solidarity here in London is to bring about the permanent peace in which the Palestinian people will no longer ever be under occupation again.
There are of course other marches around the country and around the world. And through these collective actions, we can change the public discourse.
Everything is Hamas. Everything is cool when you blow up the school. Everything is Hamas. You can bomb a hospital.